We are telling ourselves that it is transitory. Like we said a few years ago, we are telling ourselves that it is just for now. It is fake inflation. It is all just for now. It is just the fuel because the Strait of Hormuz is blocked up for the time being. I am not sure I believe that anymore, and it starts to seem as though the 3.8 number could be something that lasts for a very long time. And I wonder if that would have a structural effect on the economy and potentially on markets as well. And I have a memory that at the very start of the war, I came on your show and I said there is a long history of excess optimism at the beginning of wars, that a more realistic assessment should be that it was likely to be far longer with a far greater economic cost. Today, number 39, that is the percentage of Republicans who think Trump would beat them in a physical fight. That is according to a new poll from research firm YouGov. And in other news, celebrations at YouGov after winning the Pulitzer Prize for Best Survey Question Ever. Welcome to Prof G Markets. I am Ed Elson. It is the 13th of May. Let us check in on yesterday's market vitals. The SP and the Nasdaq fell after the latest inflation reading came in higher than expected. We will talk about that shortly. Oil prices continued to rise as tensions between Iran and the U.S. remained elevated. Treasury yields also climbed. And finally, the Senate confirmed Kevin Warsh as Fed governor, clearing a major hurdle toward becoming Fed chair. Okay, what else is happening? Inflation soared in April, up 3.8% from a year earlier. That is the highest inflation reading in 3 years and even hotter than economists had expected. Energy accounted for 40% of the month-to-month increase and was up 18% from a year earlier. But price pressures are spreading beyond fuel core inflation, which excludes food and energy prices, climbed 2.8% from a year ago. And for the first time in 3 years, wages are no longer keeping up with prices, which essentially means that real wages are falling. Here to discuss these numbers and the state of the economy, we are speaking with our friend Justin Wolfers, professor of economics and public policy at the University of Michigan and founder of Platypus Economics, his new YouTube channel, Substack, and podcast. Justin, welcome back to the show. Let us get right into these numbers. Inflation up 3.8% year over year in April, core inflation up 2.8%. This seems to me to be the worst reading we have seen in a long time. I guess the question is, how bad is it? Ed, just hearing you go through those numbers caused the worry lines to itch a little deeper right now, and I was in a good mood before I started talking to you. Two things are true. This is a high inflation read. The cost of living is rising. It is rising sharply. People are finding it hard to keep up. The affordability crisis is real. The second thing, as true, is none of this is yet deeply problematic. So let me back up and say and point that out. There is two inflation measures you just pointed to. ED1 was headline inflation that answers a specific question if I care about the cost of living. What happened to the cost of living? That is it. It rose. And so if you feel like you are not keeping up, the truth is when you are paying $4 a gallon, you are not. Second question is, what is going on with the future of inflation? And that is where economists tend to look at core inflation. We exclude food and energy. Food goes up and down with droughts and avian flu and stuff like that. Energy goes up and down with strife in the Middle East. And so neither really capture the underlying inflationary momentum or the inflationary psychology, and that at 2.8% is lightly uncomfortable but not miserable. And a question, and perhaps the question over the next few months, is how much will we be able to keep this as an energy crisis Iran temporary story? Remember, there's still some tariff business going on versus how much does it gain its own momentum, start to feed its way into inflation expectations and become something substantially more to worry about. Because getting inflation down from 3% to 2% would require slowing the economy quite substantially. So this gets to the heart of the problem, which seems to be that it is really, when you look at the numbers, it is mostly a fuel problem. It is mostly an energy problem, or at least 40% of the problem was the cost of energy, which is because of the fact that the Strait of Hormuz is closed, because we at war with Iran, which leads to the simple question of when will that be over? And this was asked in so many words to the president yesterday. He was asked whether the financial pressure facing Americans was going to influence his decision-making in Iran. And his response was striking. I just want to play you this clip and get your reaction. The only thing that matters when I am talking about Iran, they can have a nuclear weapon. I don't think about American financial situation. I don't think about anybody. I think about one thing: we cannot let Iran have a nuclear weapon. That is all. That is the only thing. Your reactions to that clip, actually. I thought it was going to be much worse. So what a relief. Look, let me start by agreeing with the president. I think it is probably immoral to go to war in order to deliver low gas prices. I don't want him to walk around doing that. I think the stakes of war are so much larger, they are human. Gas prices is narrow, small, short-term, small, and selfish. What I noted, though, is the mission changed, which is originally we were going in there to free the Iranians from the yoke of oppression. That all we wanted was regime change. And we did, in fact, get rid of Ayatollah Khamenei, which is why we now have instead Ayatollah Khamenei. I understand there is a vast difference between the two. Scoring this war is so damn difficult because the president refuses to say why we there. Having said that, it is okay for him not to be laser focused on what this does to the cost of living for Americans. Let me come back and give the other side of that. Partly because I do think the stakes, if we talking about the freedom of 90 million people or the possibility a crazy regime may bomb us to smithereens, those stakes are just enormous. and I am happy to pay a little more at the pump if those are what we achieve. I want to be clear, so far we've achieved nothing, right? So at the start of the war, the Strait of Hormuz was open. We had Ayatollah Khamenei and the Iranians had nuclear material. Strait of Hormuz is closed. They have Ayatollah Khamenei and they still have nuclear material. So I do not feel any sense of why my life's better here. I think the reason people have a right to resent this is the president never tried to make the case to the American people here is an important and noble goal from which I am going to ask sacrifice. He seems constitutionally incapable of asking for sacrifice. Sacrifice is a thing that populations do when they reconsidering war. That is an adult, grown-up, mature conversation. Just like saying, I am going to start a tariff war and prices aren't going to rise. Is an immature lie. You might think there is a serious argument to be had about defending American manufacturing or some argument. It is not my argument there. LL be some costs and there LL be some benefits. But I think this leads to a better world. That is a mature conversation, not even having the conversation before putting Americans' prosperity, livelihoods, and in some case children at risk. It is not my way of doing things. Man. Yeah, when we think about what is happening with inflation here, and you mentioned the difference between core inflation versus overall inflation, we strip out food, we strip out energy because it is volatile. It can skew the data in a lot of ways, and Trump has kind of made this argument where he says that the increase in oil prices and fuel prices is fake inflation, like it is a different thing. And on the one hand, you can kind of make that argument, but on the other hand, it is like we still at war here. And there is no indication that this is going to end anytime soon. And in fact, the more that they keep on telling us a deal is about to happen, we about to get somewhere. There is going to be a ceasefire, and then suddenly it does happen. It happens over and over and over again. It starts to become kind of clear, at least to me, that this is going to last for a very, very long time. And it starts to look a lot like Iraq. It starts to look a lot like Afghanistan, where they said it was going to be a couple of weeks, it was going to be a couple of months, and then it ended up being 8 years, or it ended up being 2 decades. And so it seems as though a very similar situation could play out here, where we retelling ourselves that it is transitory, like we said a few years ago. We retelling ourselves, oh, it is just for now. It is fake inflation. It is all just for now. It is just the fuel, because the Strait of Hormuz is just blocked up for the time being. I am not sure I believe that anymore. And it starts to seem as though the 3.8 number could be something that lasts for a very long time. And I wonder if that would have a structural effect on the economy and potentially on markets as well. And I have a memory that at the very start of the war, I came on your show and I said everything that economic theory and history tells me is that there is a very large risk this takes a lot longer than 4 to 5 weeks, and almost no chance it takes less, and that there is a long history of excess optimism at the beginning of wars, and that a more realistic assessment should be that it was likely to be far longer with a far greater economic cost. That is right. I take no great pleasure in being right. I just want to remind you I was food and energy. Let me say 2 things about it. One, we take it out for the reasons I described earlier, which is if you want to, we leave it in for the reasons I described. If you want to describe the cost of living, it has gone up. Americans are sacrificing. If you want to know what is happening to inflationary psychology, we take it out. But there is a very real risk it spills over and becomes part of the process. And that is very much what is on the Fed's mind right now, that in our models, people should think about inflation coming from energy differently from other things, from reality. They may not, particularly after several years in a row of inflation being above the Fed's target. And finally, this wasn't the question you asked, but I do want to put it in there. Food and energy is something we look through as part of a statistical exercise. I want to predict inflation. What are the most persistent aspects? But food and energy are also a very large part of the consumption basket of the world as poor. And so the World Bank and the IMF have pointed out, if you wanted to think about who is really going to be hurt by high food and energy prices, it is actually the most vulnerable in the world, right? And again, if we could have a mature, responsible conversation about whether or not to go to war, part of that, one hopes the American conscience cares somewhat about hunger and poverty beyond our shores, and the consequences there are very large. And you and I so far have been talking about the United States economy. And it is worth remembering that the U.S. economy is actually much less affected than many of our allies, and that Europe and Asia are feeling much more pain than we are. And those folks, even more than the American people, weren't asked their feelings about this either. Yeah, it seems as though this has to come back to bite us in a very real way at some point. And so far the markets have been extremely resilient. Is that because I agree with that? So look, here's the glib answer. The glib answer is the stock market is at an all-time high. Therefore, the market thinks the war is fine. That is glib because markets reflect lots of things. So let us think about it in a more focused way. Let us say that the market is partly responding to the war, partly the AI boom, and partly other stuff. And if what you want to do is take the market's response as a vote of confidence in the war, then what you need to do is isolate the part that is due to the war. How might we do that? Well, one answer is we can look every single time that the president has been more belligerent and pushed into the war. Markets have fallen literally as he speaks, every single time he steps back and looks like he might talk. Markets rise. So that is markets saying they reacting as if they believe that Americans' large companies will be more profitable over the longer run if the president would have stepped back from the conflict rather than stepping into the conflict. You could actually go even a step further and try and quantify this. So if only we had some index of trouble being caused by the Middle East, then what we do is we would see how that index was correlated with the stock market. I do not have the perfect index, but I got a pretty good one, which is oil prices. Yeah, all the movements up and down in oil prices are about, is there more trouble, more strife? Are we moving towards war or not? And it turns out on a day in which oil prices rise 10%, the S&P 500 falls by 0.9%. On average, you just draw a scatter plot and you will find that you can get fancy and call it a regression coefficient. And so that tells you there's very strong statistically significant evidence that whatever it is that is driving oil prices up and down, and we know what it is, has big negative effects on US stocks. We also know that the oil price is up about 60 or 70% over the course of the war. And so if you want to extrapolate my point, negative 0.9 coefficient that says you take the 70% rise in oil prices, multiply by minus 0.9, and you can say that US stocks are about 6% lower than they would otherwise be at 6.3% as a result of this war. And then I am just going to be conservative and round that down to 5%. So I think this analysis very back of the envelope, but we in the middle of a war. No one is giving you strong answers. You know, I am not going to defend it till the day I die, but I think it is informative. This says that US stocks are 5 percentage points lower as a result of the president's aggression so far. Yes, because we have all of these other things that are buoying the economy and that we all very excited about because earnings have been very strong. We do have the AI build out occurring as planned. We LLC what happens, but we got a lot of other stuff going on, which is great, which is I think a lot of the resiliency is reflected in that. But it just does seem that, I mean, at the same time, 2/3 of the economy is consumer spending. The consumer spending has thus far been somewhat resilient, and I guess we just playing this waiting game at this point of hoping this thing will end next week or next month. And that is essentially what we are betting on, what we hoping for, and I do not know. I mean, you can hear it in my voice. This report makes me quite anxious. I mean, just as we wrap up here, the Senate confirmed Kevin Warsh as the Fed governor yesterday. This obviously, all of this inflation data is going to be very important for his decision as to what we do in terms of interest rates. Will we cut them as the president has advocated for? Doesn't he seem like a great idea? Now, just as we close here, what are your thoughts on Warsh's appointment and what do you think the path is going forward for the Federal Reserve? So, the most important question is who is Kevin Warsh? Yeah, so from 2006 to 2011, Kevin Warsh was a Fed governor, and so we know a lot about him. That was the period in which we had the global financial crisis. The global economy cratered, the U.S. economy cratered, unemployment soared, inflation was low, and we risked deflation. And throughout that entire recovery period, Warsh kept saying, I am worried inflation is going to rise. I think we should have higher interest rates. So, two things you could learn from that. One, that was a spectacularly bad judgment. It is almost certainly the case that the U.S. economy would have been better with a more aggressive response to that particular crisis. And the second is that Kevin Warsh. The 2006 to 2011 Kevin Warsh was an inflation hawk. He saw inflation around every rock through that period, was terrified of it, and wanted a forceful Fed response to it, even though we were risking deflation more than inflation. Opposite, yeah, there is a different Kevin Warsh. That Kevin Warsh was at a Senate confirmation hearing and said, I believe in Fed independence, and was asked, Fed independence, of course, means I am willing to serve the interests of the American people, even if it hurts the president's feelings. This Kevin Warsh was asked by Elizabeth Warren whether the president lost the 2020 election and thought it is so important not to hurt the president's feelings that he evaded the question altogether. That Kevin Warsh sounds like a sock puppet, and a sock puppet who would follow the president's desires, which would be to cut interest rates dramatically at a moment that the economy does to call for it. Hey man, there is two Kevin Warshes. One of them wants really high interest rates, the other one wants really low interest rates. I am glad I am not trying to live inside his head, and we're going to find out over the next few weeks and months who Kevin Warsh is. Justin Wolfers is a professor of economics and public policy at the University of Michigan and founder of Platypus Economics.